Welcome to my channel. I am Ben. Today, we step into a chilling murder case. A 16-year-old girl was attacked in a narrow, unlit alley, just a few dozen meters from her own home. And the only clear clue was the shadow of a very short man, seen stabbing again and again before vanishing into the dark. What truly happened that night remains a mystery we are about to uncover. Familiar places invite trust. A shortcut you have walked since childhood seems to fold around you like a well-worn jacket. The alley behind the market, the low wall that you hop at dusk, the hum of mopeds, and the soft chatter of neighbors. These are the sounds of home. That is why, on the evening of the 26th in 2011, when a single scream split the air in a narrow lane of Kidu, in Wujiang, in Suzhou, it felt like a betrayal. Terror had not come from a highway or a distant district. It had bloomed a few steps from someone's doorway. It was about 7:30 in the evening. The lane was thin and dim, a rib of darkness between low houses where the light from windows bled out in weak rectangles. Footsteps slapped stone. The first neighbors reached the sound and found a girl on the ground, her breathing shallow, her blood a dark halo, spilling fast and widening on the dusted concrete. Many hands pressed cloth against wounds. Voices tumbled over one another. Someone called for an ambulance, another for the police. In the swirl of urgency, an early guess rose. 7 or 8 knife wounds, maybe more. Later, when a forensic report replaced panic with numbers, that guess would feel painfully naive. The truth was 22. A witness named Jiang had been at the mouth of the lane, paying for a small purchase. When the cry cracked the evening, he pivoted, ran into the passage, and saw movement resolve into horror. A slight man crouched over the victim, arm pumping, a narrow blade rising and falling, in a rhythm that had the cold efficiency of habit. The lane's dark, gutted faces and evening haze hid details: no age, no features, but the size was unmistakable. The attacker, Jiang would say, was very short, around 1 meter 40-something to about 1 meter 50, which in U.S. terms is roughly 4'9" to about 4'11". Small in frame, quick in motion, he stabbed with a brisk economy, as if speed could finish what strength could not. Jiang shouted a single, hard syllable that snapped the moment. The blade paused. The small man's head twitched, the animal spark of detection in his posture. Then he ran. He tore down the lane toward the road. Jiang shouted for help, pointed neighbors back to the girl, and gave chase. In the seconds that followed, recall would always fight glare. As Jiang burst onto the main road, an oncoming car poured light directly into his eyes, a white sheet that burned detail out of the world. He threw an arm across his face and squinted into the beam, saw only a smear of motion, a human shape flitting near a parked sedan, and then the car's engine note rising as it pulled away. In that fractured glimpse, Jiang captured what he could: 2 9s in the middle of a license plate, and the last digit he believed had a roundness to it. A 6, a 2, a 5, or an 8. Numbers with curves at both ends. It was not much. On a night like this, it felt like a thread of gold. To detectives, the image that coalesced from Jiang's account looked like a plan. A knife attack in a lane with no cameras. A probable getaway vehicle idling at the road. This had the smell of preparation, not a random kid with a cheap blade, but at least 2 people, perhaps a small crew, allocating roles: the knifeman, the driver, the clock. Yet the alley's first conclusions would soon be contested by evidence. The notion that the girl had been stabbed 7 or 8 times fell away under the cold eye of the autopsy. 22 punctures, measurable, repeatable, final. The wounds bore the signature of a dagger, a blade about 3.5 centimeters wide, roughly 1 3/8 inches. The depth and distribution said something else detectives know. In their bones. Intent. A thief steals and cuts to escape. A killer chooses certainty. If this was not a robbery and not a failed abduction, then the lane's darkness had hosted something more deliberate. Revenge. A score from another street, another time, brought home to an address where the offender could be forced to watch grief bloom. It is a logic as old as pettiness and as modern as envy. To wound a person, strike what they love. But the alley had more to give, and not all of it supported the getaway car narrative. When officers later traced the license fragments and searched camera networks beyond Tidu, they found how darkness distorts memory. Headlights can erase the edges of a figure. A sudden break can look like a door opening. A child in a passenger seat can become an accomplice in the mind. Memory is a lens, not a mirror. It magnifies what fear wants to see. What remained, hard as the lane's stone, were the physical facts. A young woman dying in the place she should have been safest. A small, agile attacker who moved like he knew the maze. Blood spreading into a pool that neighbors would wash at dawn, but still see in their heads for years. The alley had no camera. The streetlights were tired, and the corners led to more corners. Danger loves angles. It waits where a scream is a request the city cannot hear. Detectives turned back to the body to learn what the lane would not say. The victim's name fell into the record with the quiet finality of a stamp. Xiao Lei, 16 years old, a figure barely lifted out of adolescence. She had been out to buy something simple for a household. A parent in a dinner's end, and had almost made it home. That echo would wound the search in its early days. Almost safe, almost at the door. Almost in the light of the people who knew her voice. From those first minutes, a story assembled itself in 2 layers. The visible layer, where a short man ran and a plate bore 2 9s, and the buried layer, where motive lived. 22 wounds argue from the stomach, not the wallet. They speak of anger, of insult, of someone who needed not just to end a life, but to make an example. If this was a revenge narrative, detectives knew the origin would be either intimate family, romance, pride, or performative. A message from a petty criminal world where reputation is an economy. The alley, for now, kept the prologue and hid the rest. In the nights to come, officers would return to that narrow passage in Kidu and stand very still. They would listen for how sound traveled. Note how a motorbike's idle-covered footsteps. Check the footprints where dust held shape, and reconstruct the seconds between the shout and the dash. They would mark where a car might wait without drawing a neighbor's notice. How quickly a small man could reach the road. How easy it would be for headlights to make a witness doubt his own eyes. They would measure the span of a doorway and ask how often a girl would be sent to a shop for something simple. At that hour, in that season, the lane, interrogated with patience, sometimes gives answers, but only to questions asked in the right order. For the family, there would be no right order, only a collapse. The sound that wakes a mother is not a scream, but the sudden silence after it, a silence where the street draws its breath, and the world seems to wait for a decision that has already been made. Xiaolei lay in that pause, between a life of ordinary errands and a file number. The pool of blood cooled. Remembering nothing, around it, strangers did what strangers do at their best. Called, pressed, begged, and failed. The case had begun. It would travel through blind alleys and bright rooms, through camera lenses and memories distortions, through the familiar human impulses that make violence feel both senseless and inevitable. It started, as many tragedies do, where people feel safest close to home and with an attacker whose size disguised his danger. Short is not small. A dagger is not a toy. A number of wounds is not a statistic, but a map of rage. And 22 points is a long journey when the body is young. In the ledger of the investigation, the Lane wrote down the few facts it would allow. A time about 7:30. A place, a narrow passage in Kidu. A description, a very short, quick man. A weapon, a dagger about 3.5 centimeters wide, about 1 3/8 inches. And a name, Xiao Lei. It was not enough to solve a murder. It was more than enough to keep detectives awake. The work ahead would test every assumption. Was there truly a car, or only light? Was this the revenge story that 22 wounds seemed to name, or the botched theft that pride can turn into homicide in a heartbeat? In the days to come, the case would give those answers. But on that first night, the city knew only this. A girl had died almost at her door, and the little man with the cheap dagger had vanished into the angles. The first hard facts arrived not from theory, but from the ground. The victim was 16 years old, struck down not far from her door, the place where a family's lights spill into the lane like a promise. Investigators measured the distance and found that she had been attacked within about 50 meters of home, which in U.S. terms is about 164 feet. She had gone out to buy beer for her father, and the evidence of that errand lay shattered nearby in a halo of glass. This lane was the kind that invites shortcuts and assumptions, narrow, underlit, and familiar to those who lived there. At the time of the assault, there were no street lights bright enough to draw a clear portrait, and no camera looking down from a pole to remember what people forget. Only one person had seen the attack unfold with his own eyes: Jiang, the neighbor at the mouth of the lane. He could not name an age or a face, but he was certain about the size of a very short man, roughly 1.40 meters, something to 1.50 meters, which translates to about 4'9" to about 4'11", small in frame, quick in motion, cutting again and again with a narrow blade. From the first minutes, numbers tried to impose order on shock. Neighbors guessed 7 or 8 wounds. The forensic count later fixed the truth at 22, the kind of tally that speaks not of escape or warning, but of certainty. The cut pattern, and the width about 3.5 centimeters, roughly 1 3/8 inches, suggested a dagger rather than a kitchen knife. It is a bleak arithmetic known to detectives everywhere. A thief cuts once to run. A killer repeats until the body answers no. Still, Jiang's memory dangled a second thread: a license plate, 2 9s in the middle, and an end digit with a rounded shape, something like 6, 2, 5, or 8. In a place with proper lighting, that might have been enough. In this lane, memory had to fight glare. As Jiang burst from the alley, an oncoming car painted his retinas white. The figure he chased dissolved into contrast, and a parked sedan on the curb became a screen for assumption. A human shape near the door, a sudden engine note, a plate that, for an instant, looked like a getaway. Detectives did what detectives do. They searched outward. The town's few cameras offered no help, so they pushed the radius past Kidu and into Wujiang, targeting road networks where a car could be forced to show its face. Beyond the older neighborhoods, cameras dotted the thoroughfares. Over more than 1 kilometer away, more than half a mile, they began to pick up plates, vehicles, and timestamps from the night. It took 3 days to find a plate in the right pattern, 2 9s in the middle, and an end digit that could match. The hit came from a toll station camera, a device that photographs not only metal, but the people behind it. What the camera showed was not a criminal tableau, but a domestic emergency. A 60-year-old woman at the wheel, and a small child about 3 to 4 years old in the passenger seat. The registered owner was Madame Lu, who told officers she had been driving her feverish grandson to a private clinic where her daughter worked. She admitted passing the alley at around the time of the attack and braking hard when a young man in black cut across her bumper, an evasive maneuver that could, to anyone dazzled by headlights, look exactly like a pickup. The sequence clicked into place. Glare, brake, blur, assumption. What Jiang read as a door opening may have been nothing more than a car slowing to avoid an accident. The suspected getaway was an illusion born of light and fear. With the car narrative dissolved, investigators turned the map back to the footpath. They drew a circle with the crime scene at its center and began a room-by-room canvass of nearby rentals and dormitories, looking for a short, slight male. The rare stature Jiang described someone who knew the grid of lanes well enough to disappear into angles. Experience suggested a second filter, prior record. People who stabbed 22 times are rarely at their first crime. The rhythm of that violence often grows in a life where restraints have worn thin. They checked the cheap lodgings where day laborers paid in cash and vanished before dawn. They checked stairwells that would remember blood on a handrail. The city gave them nothing. The case seemed to widen and thin at once. With no cameras in the immediate grid and no corroborating witnesses besides Jiang, the alley behaved like alleys do in older quarters. It kept its secrets. While rumor filled the vacuum, the victim's youth, the closeness to home, the brutality, these were ingredients that pour easily into urban folklore. Detectives knew that unchecked stories can shape action as surely as evidence, pulling resources toward vengeance theories that feel satisfying but lead into fog. Even so, theory must be tested against fact. The forensic conclusion: the dagger width. The 22 repetitions kept pointing away from a simple theft and toward rage that outlived the moment. It did not have to be personal in the intimate sense. Rage can be impersonal pride, a criminal's refusal to be humiliated, an explosion when a small man discovers the person he chose to rob will not comply. But if there had been planning beyond the choice of a dark lane and a cheap blade, the cameras should have caught partners at the periphery. They did not. For now, the attacker looked like one body, one weapon, one exit. Investigators returned to the timeline and built a minute-by-minute reconstruction. At about 7:30 in the evening, the victim left the house with coins, enough for soda and beer. She walked the familiar lane, bought what she needed, and started back. The bottle shattered at some point during the struggle. Shards glinted in torchlight when officers arrived. From the first scream to the first neighbor on the scene, the window was short, the kind of window in which a fast, slight man can reach the road and not be seen again. Headlights and braking then stitched a mirage over the moment he disappeared. The question became not where a car had gone, but where a man on foot could hide. In the older belts of eastern Chinese cities, the rental economy often runs on cash and silence. Identities blur, names change, spelling, and a cleaner forgets a face 2 days after a tenant leaves. Officers knocked on doors with measured persistence, asking after a short newcomer, a man with fresh scratches or with laundry soaking longer than usual, a man who still smelled faintly of metal and sweat. The answers were polite, then wary, then repetitive. No one knew him. No one had seen him. The city looked straight through the profile they drew. When a neighborhood refuses to speak, investigators change the question. If the motive was not theft, if 22 cuts mark anger, not strategy, then the attacker's choice of place matters more than his choice of exit. He struck where the victim was small and the lights were dim, within sight of a home that could not help. That suggests a predator of opportunity, scanning lanes for risk and reward, not a soldier in a crew waiting for a signal. The cheap dagger becomes another kind of clue. A budget tool, easy to buy 2 days before a job, easy to throw into a ditch. The scene's emptiness, no footprints legible enough to cast, No camera for a frame becomes not an accident, but a selection. Yet even in a selection, there is accident. If the victim had met him 10 minutes earlier, the lane might have been busier. 10 minutes later, a father might have stepped onto the threshold for evening air. Fate rides such margins. The distance, about 50 meters, about 164 feet, is the kind a runner covers in seconds. It is also the kind that feels, to families, like a mile of guilt. As the third day closed with no arrest, and as the car lead collapsed into explanation, the task force wrote a new directive. Expand the perimeter. Re-interview the toll station staff who saw the plate with 2 9s. Cross-check the child in car with clinic logs to confirm the fever visit. Verify Madame Lu's route and break timestamp against the municipal camera map. With each confirmation, Jiang's misreading looked more forgivable. The product of a human eye punished by headlight geometry. Everything now hinged on 2 stubborn truths. First, the attacker's size, that rare, very short stature in an adult male, should have made him distinct in any building where he slept, any crew where he worked. Second, the violence, 22 wounds with a dagger with blade, should have left traces on cloth and skin, in cuts across the knuckles, or blood dried in the welt of a shoe. Truths like these do not break a case by themselves. They just wait, patient as stone, while a city of habits moves and someone, somewhere, notices that the small man from the next bunk washes his hands too long. The investigation was about to trade blur for focus, but in these early days, the shape of the story was still drawn by absence. No car, no camera, no name. Only a teenager dead within steps of home, a witness half blinded by light, and a profile so narrow that it felt, to detectives, both promising and cruel. In the ledger of this case, the next line would not come from a theory. It would come from a place that sells cheap steel. The alley had nothing more to give. No camera watched the mouth of the lane. No second witness could name a face. The small man who stabbed and ran seemed to have folded himself into the city's seams and disappeared, with the escape route smudged by glare and assumption. Detectives did what patient investigators always do. They turned from the killer to the life he had broken and asked the victim to tell them who he was. They began with the simplest clock. A mother had pressed 10 yuan into her daughter's palm and sent her to the corner shop for soda and beer. A sweet drink for the child she still saw, and a bitter one for the father who would be waiting. The errand should have lasted less than 10 minutes. It ended as neighbors poured into a narrow, unlit corridor, a few dozen meters from the family's door. The mother, hearing the riot of feet and shouted names, ran outside and met a truth that no parent can rehearse. The body on the ground was her child's. At the scene, a 1 yuan coin lay where change had fallen. It was a tiny thing, bright, easy to see, and it stayed. Detectives read that coin the way old cops read rain on a windshield. A robber hungry for money does not leave the only coin he can grab. A robber desperate for a phone or purse does not stand over a victim and stab 22 times. They were not ready to rule out theft, but the coin, the youth of the victim, and the ferocity of the attack kept pulling the case toward a different grammar. Anger. A break arrived from the weeds. In a strip of grass not far from the lane, an officer's flashlight found steel, a dagger, its blade stained dark. Forensics would lock one part of the story in place. The blood on the blade matched the victim's profile. The handle yielded no fingerprints, and the edges were so crisp they looked nearly new. The absence of prints suggested gloves. The condition of the steel suggested an object bought for this task. It was a slender weapon, the kind whose blade runs about 3.5 centimeters wide, roughly 1 3/8 inches, a detail that fit the wound pattern cataloged on the slab. If the blade spoke of intent, motive had to be tested against the world the girl had moved through. Revenge is a familiar ghost in cases like these, sometimes aimed not at the offender, but at those they love. So officers asked a harder question. Who among the adults around this child would be worth hurting through a daughter? The answers came back spare and steady. The family were migrants, people from Taiha village in Henan who had worked in Wujiang for more than 7 years, sending money back so grandparents could keep 2 sisters in food and school. The father worked in a machine shop. The mother stitched long hours in a garment factory. There were no debts that neighbors knew about, no feuds that had stiffened into threats. About a year earlier, the older sister had come to the city to work and lived with the parents. The victim herself had left school after the 9th grade and, half a month before the murder, arrived to look for a job. She had no boyfriend, no quick romance to scorch into a fatal triangle. Each check cut away the drama that rumors like to add. Each check made revenge feel thinner. Robbery stepped forward again, briefly. But detectives kept returning to the same hard incompatibilities. A cheap blade, used with relentless repetition, change left on the ground. A target who did not look wealthy and carried very little cash. A thief does not waste time. A scene like this one wastes nothing but life. For now, they wrote the motive not as a noun, but as a hanging possibility, a line left blank. Time did what time does. In cases without a name, it widened the family's fear. Half a month passed. The parents began to wonder whether the girl's death was not the end of a story, but the beginning of a larger threat. A warning shot before another blow. Detectives, who had hoped the attacker's rare stature, a grown man under about 1.50 m, roughly 4'11", would make him simple to find, learned again how a city can hide a profile even when it is distinct. Leads died. Days stacked. The map stayed blank. When the alley will not talk, steel sometimes will. Investigators pushed a retail trace on the dagger, an old-fashioned grind of shoe leather and receipts. They visited every hardware and metalware shop in Wujiang, asked for recent dagger sales, and pulled camera footage where cameras existed. The faces on the screens were wrong. Too tall, too heavy, gestures all wrong. For the quick, very short silhouette Jiang had described. In most homes they visited, the purchasers still had the daggers they had bought. Those were excluded with relief and frustration. The circle widened to neighboring districts and provinces. The work multiplied. The answers did not. Meanwhile, a city did what cities do. The victim's age, the nearness to home, the violence. These were ingredients for folklore. Stories that begin as speculation and harden into certainty over tea. In those stories, the killer often travels with a driver. The plan is always deliberate, and the reason is always revenge. Detectives had already learned to doubt the getaway car, a mirage born of headlights, a brake, and a human eye in shock. And they could prove it now, with interviews and camera confirmations well beyond the lane. The plate with 2 9s and the rounded final digit had led them to a grandmother rushing a feverish child to a private clinic. An innocent passage that created the perfect illusion when a young man in black sprinted across her bumper. Theory bowed to optics. The car was never a partner. It was a bystander. With that distraction dead, they returned to people. They canvassed boarding rooms and cash rentals, looking for a man who would stand out in any crowd of laborers. Very short, slight, perhaps with fresh scratches across the knuckles, or a shoe welt that still smelled faintly of iron. Landlords shrugged. Neighbors smiled politely. The city, so dense you could measure it in breaths, somehow offered no one who matched the sketch the witness had given. The description was both promising and cruel. Specific enough to imagine, not specific enough to find. Detectives then inched the question sideways. If this had been anger, not profit, Then place mattered more than escape. The attacker had chosen an unlit lane where a small girl would walk within about 50 meters of home, roughly 164 feet, and where help could hear her scream but not reach her in time. This was not the mathematics of a crew with a driver. It was the eyesight of a predator of opportunity, a man who tested corridors for risk and reward, and carried the kind of cheap steel that can be purchased 2 days before a crime and thrown away 2 minutes after. The dagger in the grass did not feel like a calling card. It felt like a tool, used hard and discarded fast. In that reading, Chance sat side by side with Choice 10 minutes earlier. The lane might have been busier. 10 minutes later, a father might have stepped outside for air. A sprinting man can swallow 50 meters in seconds. A grieving family can hold that same distance in their chest as a mile of guilt for the rest of their lives. Pressure rose. The Wujiang task force felt heat from above. The family felt a colder pressure from within, the kind that cracks sleep and shreds appetite. Investigators, running out of streets to ask and cameras to check, turned their wheels in a new direction, back to the family's hometown in Henan. In villages, they knew, truth and rumor share a fence. Sometimes a case needs to listen to both. What they heard there, whispered across thresholds and repeated in the square, was a story with the shape of an answer and the risk of a trap. Perhaps the girl had died in a mistaken revenge. A message sent to a house by someone who had the wrong address. It was a theory with hooks. It would need facts. And it would ask detectives to decide how much of anger is personal and how much is just aim. Rumor is a kind of map. It points not always to the truth, but to the places fear is already circling. As detectives worked through the void left by headlight glare, a story from the family's village in Henan drifted in like a weather front. It had a name, a face, a motive, and the kind of symmetry that makes people certain before the facts can be. A man surnamed Wang, short, poor, orphaned young, had once pursued the victim's older sister, Xiao En, with a devotion that village courtyards still gossiped about. The parents disapproved. The sisters, so alike in appearance that neighbors said 80 to 90% were separated by only 2 years. In city light, one could be mistaken for the other. If revenge had traveled across provinces, the whisper went, perhaps it had landed on the wrong girl. The fit, at first glance, was eerie. 2 days before the murder on the 24th, Wang had quietly left Taiha village with no forwarding word, a departure time that nested almost perfectly inside the homicide's window. He was said to be around 1 meter 50, perhaps less, about 4'11", which matched the witness description like a key half turned in a lock. The short man who stabbed and ran, the suitor who would not give up, the sister who had fled to Wujiang to escape him on the page. It read like motive's calling card. But paper isn't the world. When police traced Wang, they found him across the water in Fujian, signed on with a friend to a fishing boat. On the night of the 26th, when Xiaolei died within about 50 meters, about 164 feet of home, the boat's deck lights and crew roll gave him an alibi that did not bend. Men who had hauled nets beside him swore he was there. He admitted he had once loved Xiao En, and that the family had refused him, but he denied any plan to hurt anyone. The revenge-mistaken target narrative, elegant and cruel, collapsed under the plain weight of time and place. The lead died, and with it, the small comfort of a villain that the village already knew. The case slid back toward absence, no partner car, no second witness, no name, until a different kind of map appeared, one drawn not by rumor, but by retail. In Huzhou, in Zhejiang province, just across the administrative border from the city where the murder occurred, investigators found a hardware shop that sold the exact style of dagger whose 3.5 centimeter, about 1 3/8 inch blade matched the autopsy grid. The owner said business in that model had been brisk in the half-month before the killing, both wholesale and single sales. There was a problem. A ceiling repair had damaged the security system a week earlier. There was a solution. A frantic call to technicians, a hard drive pulled and rebuilt. And then, like a tide returning, 3 months of footage flickered back to life. Soon, a shape stepped out of the pixels. On the 24th, 2 days before Xiaolei screamed in the lane, a man in black with a white cap entered the store, asked where the knives were, walked straight to the display, selected one dagger, paid, and left. He never offered his face to the camera. He moved like a person who knew exactly where the lenses slept and how to walk around their gaze. Less than 1.6 meters tall, not quite 5'3", even with the cap he still stood shorter than a cashier, who herself was under 1.6. The gestures were spare. The purpose was plain. He had come for the steal and nothing else. Cameras remember what people forget, but shopkeepers remember what cameras miss. When detectives paused the frame, the owner did not need time. She knew him. He was Liu, a drifter who slept in a nearby slum lane, working odd jobs when there were odd jobs to be had, waiting at the day labor corner, salvaging scrap when there wasn't. He drifted enough that everyone knew him, the way you know a stray dog that circles the same market stalls at dusk. Liu had been in and out for years. He did not talk much. He did not grow. He matched the shape Jiang had chased. The file filled fast after that. His name was Liu Xinqiu, born 1974, from Hunan. At 23, in 1997, he had been sentenced to 11 years for robbery. He earned reductions for good behavior and walked out in early 2005, only to be administratively detained for 5 days by Wenzhou police later that year for petty theft. A life with bars in it teaches certain rhythms. The 22 cuts in the lane dense, mechanical, committed, played to that music. The cheap dagger in the grass, almost new, with the victim's blood but no fingerprints, sounded like the rest. Gloves on, walk fast, drop the tool in the weeds, disappear into the angles. None of this erased what had already been learned. The car that Jiang thought he saw 2 nines in the middle, a round-edged final digit, belonged to a grandmother rushing a feverish child to a clinic. The supposed pickup was a brake to avoid a young man in black darting across her bumper. There was never a driver waiting with an engine on. There was glare and assumption, stitched into a mirage by the geometry of headlights. When that mirage vanished, the case's spine re-emerged. One man, one weapon, one footpath out. With Wang eliminated, and Liu now sitting sharp on the page, the task force began to translate profile into proof. They mapped the distance from the Huzhou shop to the Wujiang lanes, drove the route at evening traffic, and timed how long a very short, quick man would need to walk from one to the other's corridors with a small purchase in his pocket. They re-watched the toll station reels. They had already bled for clues. This time, not for a plate with 2 nines, but for a body, a man who hugged shadows, who moved under 5'3", who boarded buses last and sat with his cap pulled down. They recanvassed cheap rentals, not asking only for a short man, but for a short man named Liu, the kind who did cash work and came home smelling like metal. The city, which had refused to see a silhouette, was suddenly being asked to recognize a neighbor. And still, detectives kept a hand on the earliest truths because cases can warp when a new name arrives. Xiaolei had died within about 50 meters, about 164 feet of home, at about 7:30 in the evening, holding tasks so ordinary they sound like a lullaby. The weapon's width about 3.5 centimeters, about 1 3/8 inches, spoke of a dagger, not a kitchen knife. The blow count 22, argued certainty, not warning. If Liu was the man in the lens, those facts would not merely connect to him, they would have to fit him, the way a shoe welt remembers the pattern of a tread. The village rumor had offered an answer wrapped in a story about love and spite. The shop footage offered an answer wrapped in habit, a man who knew cameras, who bought cheap steel 2 days before a girl was slaughtered, who lived in the shadows beside the market stalls and the day labor curb, who was small enough to be overlooked and fast enough to stay that way. In homicide, there are motives that make sense, and men who make a habit of crossing lines, even when there is no sense at all. The next steps would decide which kind Liu was. For now, the city had moved 1 square closer to a name you could knock on a door with. The case turned again on the kind of detail that hides in clerks' ledgers and station windows. 2 days after a small man in a dark lane carved a girl's life into 22 points, investigators found a record that narrowed the night's vastness to a single seat on a bus. At 9 in the morning on the 26th, a man named Liu Xinchu bought a ticket bound for Wujiang, the district where Xiaolei would be stabbed that evening, within about 50 meters of home, roughly 164 feet. The manifest described him as 1 meter 49, slender, frail. In U.S. terms, that is about 4 foot 10. The number, the root, the stature, each line of ink echoed what a witness had run toward and then chased into glare. From there, the work became a map of doors. Wujiang police pushed notices across borders and asked allies to watch their own seams. More than 20 days passed before the line snapped taut. On the 17th, officers in Hangzhou found Liu on a construction site, a day laborer among day laborers, sleeping in a canvas shack that remembered only the weight of men and the smell of concrete dust. They waited until evening, then hit the camp. When the shouting settled, Liu was on the floor in cuffs. Under a cot, they found a pair of shoes with dried blood in the welt. In the lab's unflinching light, the profile on those stains answered to Xiaolei. The city had a name with DNA stuck to it. What followed had the ceremony of consequence. Detectives drove Liu back along the roads he had taken and staged a crime scene reenactment. The choreography grim, the crowd in the thousands, the cameras held aloft by strangers who wanted to see what hate looks like up close. In frame after frame, Liu stood shorter than 1.5 meters, under about 4 foot 11, his cap low, his chin tucked, his body speaking the same smallness that Zhang the witness had described on the first night. In forensic terms, it was a silhouette, matching a silhouette. In human terms, it was the shock of scale, how little a body can be, and how much harm it can learn to do. The questions pressed in. Where had he learned the rhythm that produced 22 wounds with the steadiness of habit? Why the narrow blade, about 3.5 centimeters wide, about 1 3/8 inches, and the choice of a lane with no camera? Investigators did not have to guess from scratch. Liu, born 1974 in Hunan, had built a life on the wrong side of restraint. At 23, in 1997, he drew 11 years for robbery. Released in 2005 for good behavior, he was detained again in Wenzhou for petty theft later that year. A man who has spent his 20s on a clock not of his own making learns how to work with walls and routines. The dagger recovered in the grass near the lane, almost new. No prints. Only the victim's blood fit that instruction manual. Gloves on, tool purchased, tool discarded. But records alone cannot answer motive. For that, detectives let Liu speak and checked each word against the map they already held. He was 37, unmarried. A man with money troubles old enough to have their own habits. His parents had died when he was about 20. In the years when China's construction boomed, He could make 2 to 3,000 yuan in a good month, a respectable sum 2 decades ago. And yet he spent as quickly as he earned. He drank, he gambled, he borrowed what people would give, and asked foremen for advances when no one else would. He was irresponsible at work, walked off sites for days, came back when hunger pinched. Slowly, foremen stopped taking his calls. Colleagues stopped vouching. Friends thinned to acquaintances, stubborn and hot-tempered. He heard advice as insult and correction as a stranger's attempt to rule him. The result was a city that knew him by sight and would not keep him. A few days before the murder, the money was gone again. Habit steered him to an old idea: robbery. Do it cleaner than before, he thought. Choose a place with no camera and no light. A scene the city would not remember. He left Huzhou in Zhejiang and slipped into Wujiang in Jiangsu, a grid he knew from past work. The plan required a victim that his size could control. Liu admitted it. He avoided men outright. He avoided tall women, too, assuming that a body larger than his could overturn the attempt by sheer panic and weight. His eye hunted for someone small, shorter, lighter, younger, someone he could drag across the margin between a request and a threat. That evening, in the half-light of about 7:30, he saw Zhao Lei. She was 16, carrying home the last errands of the day: soda for herself, beer for her father. Liu closed distance, showed her the dagger, and demanded money. Zhao Lei told him the simple truth. She had only 1 yuan left. Then, by his account, she scolded him, called him a kind of man who steals rather than works, a small man looking for a smaller target. It is not hard to imagine those words in a neighborhood where people still speak plainly, where youth and anger share a quick edge. Her family would later say that such a reaction fit her. Strong-willed, unwilling to reward what she knew was wrong. But for Liu, insult landed like a thrown stone on water, already tight with pride. He stabbed, and when momentum and rage had stacked a count he had not planned, he kept stabbing still, long past the moment when a thief becomes a killer. In interrogation, his rationalizations were as small as his body and just as sharp. He said he was angry at being cursed and taught a lesson by a child. He said that once he had gone that far, even if she lived, she would be broken, a burden the family would pay for, a cost he could not. Beneath the excuses ran a simpler current. He had chosen a lane and a victim that made him feel large. And when reality refused to shrink for him, he cut it until it did. On paper, that is motive. In the room, it is the old music of humiliation. Weaponized. Pieces that had once looked like a gang's choreography, now stacked into a lone man's pattern. The supposed getaway car, dissolved into an old woman's brake and a witness's headlight blindness. The license fragments, 2 nines and a rounded final digit, pointed not to an accomplice, but to a grandmother rushing a feverish grandchild to a clinic, and the map stripped down to its spine. 1 man, 1 weapon, 1 footpath, out with confession and DNA, with height and footwear, and a ticket at 9 in the morning. The case began to close in the way that good cases do, not with a twist, but with a tightening. In the ledger of facts, the entries now aligned down the page. Liu Xin-chu bought cheap steel 2 days before a murder. He traveled to Wujiang the morning of the night. A girl screamed. He chose a dark lane and a small target. He abandoned the dagger near the scene. He bled the victim's blood onto his shoes and slept on them. He moved through a city's margins, the way water finds its own level downhill, through the seams, into corners, until a line of names, faces, and recordings stood him up in front of a judge. Some crimes leave behind puzzles. This one left behind warnings that the distance between a home's light and a lane's darkness can be a few dozen meters, and still be a world. That size is a poor proxy for danger. That the price of cheap steel is never the price on the receipt. It is counted instead in the nights a family can no longer sleep and the way a neighborhood walks differently in the dusk. When detectives finally closed the file, they did not write an ending so much as a recipe for vigilance. Trust the places you know, but count the angles. Teach the young to name wrong out loud, and also to step back when wrong carries a blade. Remember that cities are not safe because they are familiar, but because the familiar remain alert. In the end, the law spoke in a voice that was quiet and final. In December 2011, a court sentenced Liu Jin-chu to death for intentional homicide. There was no romance in the paperwork, no twist to dignify the cruelty. The file described a robbery that sparked into murder and a young girl who died because a small man, angered by words, decided that certainty required a blade. It mattered that night that he had taken nothing. Not a phone, not a wallet, not even the last 1 yuan coin the girl carried home. He left only blood and a weapon in the weeds. He would later say, sharp as his body and just as mean, that being scolded by a teenager lit him like a fuse. He stabbed more than 20 times and told himself that once he had gone that far, even survival would mean a life broken and expensive. It was the sort of thinking that turns humiliation into arithmetic. Families do not measure grief in legal terms. They measure it in distances and delays. Xiaolei had fallen within less than 50 meters of home, about 164 feet, on a strip of lane that felt like an extension of a living room. There were no bright streetlights to make faces legible, and no camera to remember what fear forgets. That absence had always been part of the map. It was how he chose the place. It was why help arrived only to count and to carry. In the retelling, people will try to locate a reason they can live with. Some will say that the girl's defiance, her refusal to reward theft with obedience, was a spark in dry grass. Others will answer that courage without allies in a dark corridor is a risk that belongs to the world, not to youth. Both thoughts can be true at once. Adolescence trains honesty faster than it trains tactics. In lanes like this, survival sometimes prefers silence to victory. The investigation had already stripped the story of a phantom driver. A witness, half blinded by headlights, had watched a sedan brake hard as a young man in black flashed across its bumper and wondered, in that stitched second, imagined a getaway that never was. The grandmother at the wheel had been racing a feverish child to a clinic. Geometry, not conspiracy, tied the scene in a knot. When police untied it, the case's spine reappeared. One man, one dagger, one footpath out. Proof followed like weight. Thousands packed the reenactment, and in every frame the suspect's body held the same, unmistakable smallness. Under about 1.5 meters, under roughly 4'11", he matched the first witness, not by face, but by proportion, the way a shoeprint matches a tread. In his camp bed, officers found shoes whose welt still remembered the victim's blood. In the lab, that memory answered to Xiaolei. Shame does not own microscopes. Evidence does. The blade had told its part as well. Its 3.5 centimeter width, about 1 3/8 inches, had carved wounds that spoke of intent rather than escape. It was nearly new, a piece of cheap steel bought 2 days before the murder and discarded minutes after. It fit a life that moved along the city's seams, trading foremen for wagers and friends for acquaintances, scratching at pride until anything felt like an insult, and any insult felt like a debt. Verdicts cannot repair a street. They can only keep the next one from breaking the same way. This case hardened into warnings that sounded ordinary because they were cries tens. That proximity is not safety, that a short frame can carry long harm, that a lane with weak light and no camera is a corridor where screams travel farther than help. That the price of cheap steel is paid forever by those who never touched the receipt. The lesson was not to unlearn courage, but to match it with tactics to count the angles, to choose the brighter route, to make the call, and step away when a blade asks for obedience. When the folder closed, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a map. Updated, a dot for the place where a family's lights ended and the city's shadows began. A line for the route a small man took when he needed to feel large. And a note in a hand every neighbor could read. Be careful where the street forgets your name.